Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have witnessed an enormous amount of destruction, suffering and chaos in one of the largest European countries. Major Ukrainian cities are constantly attacked by Russian missiles, airstrikes and heavy artillery, and while the entire world is in shock watching millions of refugees fleeing the country and remaining Ukrainian civilians sheltering in fear, you would probably think that everyone is against this aggression on Ukraine by Russia and Vladimir Putin. But what if I told you that the recent polls are indicating that Putin's popularity actually increased after the invasion of Ukraine? According to the polls, more than 70% of Russians are supporting the invasion, so the obvious question is why? In this video, we will examine a pro-Russian narrative and Putin's propaganda arguments for justifying the war in Ukraine. First, we will start with the historical argument. Putin doesn't recognize Ukraine as a sovereign state. So this is the first issue. A large number of Russians, including the Russian government, are having a hard time accepting Ukraine as a real, sovereign state. It all comes down from the idea that historically speaking Ukrainians are actually Russians, who descended from the same princedom called Kievan Rus. This argument is clear in Putin's 2021 essay titled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Putin says, quote, "During the recent direct line, when I was asked about Russian-Ukrainian relations, I said that Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole. These words were not driven by some short-term considerations or prompted by the current political context. It's what I have said on numerous occasions and what I firmly believe." He continues, quote, "Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus, which was the largest state in Europe." Now, there are several problems with this. First, according to the large number of historians, Kievan Rus was a multi-ethnic kingdom consisted of many tribes who considered themselves as different from each other and who often fought one another. So the idea that Kievan Rus is some kind of universal Slavic kinship is false. From that, it follows that it's wrong to think of Kievan Rus as Russian or Ukrainian, but rather as a kingdom of many different Slavic tribes. So when Putin says that Ukrainians are descendants of some kind of unified Russian kingdom, it's nothing but Russian nationalistic propaganda, since that thing didn't exist in actual history. Second, the logic of following strict ancestral origin to define legitimacy of ethnicity is flawed, since there is no objective way to draw the line in the past where it would be appropriate to define someone's legitimate ethnicity. The people of the same tribe can become different ethnic groups if they change and distance themselves over the time or due to the influence of a different culture, language, and so on. And Ukraine, especially western part of Ukraine, had its own course of history independent of Russia in which it shaped its national identity, culture, and language. So even if Russians and Ukrainians were once the same people, it makes no sense to think of them as the same people today. It is as foolish as it would be calling some American whose great-great ancestors came from England as an Englishman. But whether Putin really believes it or not is irrelevant. What really matters are implications of this argument. And it's something like this. If those two nations are in fact the same people, through nationalistic lenses, it follows that they must serve the same goal and interests. So in fact, true Ukrainians will always support Russian interests, since the two nations, one people, will always have the same interests. And those who are against these mutual interests can be seen as some kind of traitors. And that includes those Ukrainians who want to have national interests independent of Russian and those who lean towards the West. Or in other words, those who support joining the European Union and NATO. And Putin states this clearly in his essays. Quote, "I am confident that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. Our spiritual, human, and civilizational ties formed for centuries and have their origins in the same sources. They have been hardened by common trials, achievements, and victories. Our kinship has been transmitted from generation to generation. It is in the hearts and the memories of people living in modern Russia and Ukraine, in the blood ties that unite millions of our families. Together, we have always been and we will be many times stronger and more successful. For we are one people." And here Putin basically says behind his beautiful poetic words that Ukraine can only be actually sovereign if it follows the Russian interests. Like for example Belarus, what is kinda ironic. So through the Russian propaganda lenses, we can sum their view of Ukraine as artificially created state, consisted of the same Russian people, in fact not a sovereign state but rather a USA puppet state, run by corrupt politicians who are serving Western interests and want to further alienate Ukrainians from their motherland, Russia. Now, why is all this important? Because it plants the idea into the minds of Russians that Ukrainians are basically Russians who need some kind of liberation from their government and foreign interests propaganda. So we can now go to the next, now real Putin's propaganda argument for justifying the invasion of Ukraine. And that is the liberation argument. You probably noticed that Putin didn't call this military aggression on Ukraine as an invasion, but rather as special military operation. The reason behind it is that the Russian government doesn't consider this military action on Ukraine as an act of war, but rather as an act of liberation of the Russians in Ukraine from the genocide committed by the Ukrainian government, and also as an act of denazification of Ukraine by demilitarizing the nation. But before we start with these issues, it's important to briefly explain the ongoing war in Ukraine. The Russo-Ukrainian War started at February 2014 following the Ukrainian Euromaidan uprising against pro-Russian elected President Viktor Yanukovych. And you probably wonder why the uprising happened. The uprising was a response for Yanukovych's sudden refusal of signing the political association and free trade agreement with European Union, despite promising it earlier. Yanukovych instead chose the closer relations with Russia and turned towards the Euro-Asian Economic Union. That decision triggered massive demonstrations where thousands of Ukrainians protested against this government act and they demanded resignation of Yanukovych and his government. Instead of resignation, Yanukovych introduced dictatorship like anti-protest laws in which he tried to restrict the freedom of speech and freedom of assembly with hope of ending demonstration with government force. So he ordered Berkut Special Police Unit, which is now officially serving Russia, and that tells a lot, to violently stop demonstrations. They brutally assaulted protesting civilians and killed 3 protesters, which sparked a fight between protesters and Berkut Police Unit, resulting in deaths of at least 120 protesters and reportedly 13 Berkut police officers, with many more injured. Short period after, thousands of protesters occupied government buildings and they eventually gained control of the central square of Kiev. In the meantime, Yanukovych signed the agreement with parliamentary opposition in which they issued the formation of an interim government, constitutional reforms and early elections. The very next day, police retained from the central Kiev and Yanukovych fled the city. After he left Kiev, Ukrainian parliament unanimously voted for his removal. The reason for his removal were not only those concerned with his refusal of signing the agreement with the EU due to the Russian pressure, but also reported acts of violation of human rights, corruption, police brutality, and so on. But this new interim government wasn't supported and recognized by everyone, and to understand why, it's also important to break down political positions in Ukraine. In Ukraine, there are 2 main political positions. First category includes those political parties which are advocating liberal democracy, have pro-Western mentality, support joining the EU and NATO, and generally are against all Russian influence and culture. Those political parties have a strong support in Western and central parts of Ukraine. However, the second category includes those political parties which are pro-Russia, Eurosceptic, and generally are not supporting liberal democracy. These political parties have a strong support in southern and eastern parts of Ukraine, where there are a large number of ethnic Russians. By the way, there is also a third category of political parties which are somewhere in between those two, but they are not very important for the sake of this argument. Anyway, when the new interim government was formatted, people in some of the regions in the eastern part of Ukraine, especially in the Donbas region, started protesting against this new government. And Russia, of course, declared this removal of Yanukovych as an illegal coup and didn't recognize the interim government, so they started supporting protests in the eastern parts of Ukraine. In the next few weeks, Russia used this Ukrainian instability to stage a fraudulent elections and invade Crimea. They also gave military support to pro-Russian rebels in Donbas region, even though they officially denied it, which resulted in the creation of self-proclaimed breakaway states of Donetsk and Luhansk. This caused the ongoing war in Donbas, fought between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian separatists backed by Russia, or in other words, against Russian forces. Now, why is all of this important? It is important because it shows that it's Russia who is to be blamed for this war in Ukraine. First, with their interfering with the Ukrainian politics by pressuring Yanukovych to refuse signing the trade agreement with the European Union. Second, with violating and breaking Ukrainian territorial integrity by invading the country. And third, with giving support and military aid to rebels, which sparked the war in Donbas. But since no leader could justify aggression on another country with purely imperialistic and geostrategic motives, Putin had to use disinformation and propaganda to gain support from Russians for his actions in Ukraine. The core idea behind his propaganda machine is that Russia is not really attacking Ukraine, but defending Russians from Ukrainian oppression. So, the Russian narration tells that the real aggressor is not Russia, but Ukraine. And everything that tells otherwise is just Western propaganda. But do you know who else used exactly the same kind of reasoning to justify invasion on another country? Ironically, Adolf Hitler, from whose followers is Putin allegedly liberating Ukraine. Hitler called his war on Poland as a defensive war since Poland attacked Germany with their persecution of Germans in Poland. So Hitler had to liberate them. Similar justification used Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin for his invasion of Finland. Finland was a host and a puppet of the evil West, so Stalin had to liberate them. But at that time, it was a lot easier to convince a nation of your propaganda. In this new information age, it is a lot harder to push your propaganda, but the principle is almost the same. Those who control the media control the truth, and Putin knows that very well. So it's not a novelty that Russia is one of the most heavily media-controlling countries in the world, which is ranked at the very bottom of the list of countries regarding the freedom of the press. Russian government owns almost all international television channels and have huge control of the press. Since 2011 till today, Kremlin is fighting an open war against all independent media in Russia. Or in other words, that means taking control of them or simply removing them. And that happened to almost all of them, of which some of them are Russian Media Group, RBC, Forbes, REN TV, Gazeta.ru, Ruskaya Planeta, Rain TV, and so on. Also, in 2008, Russian government formed another powerful weapon for controlling the information in Russia called Ruskomnadzor, which is Russian Federal Executive Agency responsible for monitoring and censoring internet and media in Russia. Its purpose is to ban and restrict any media or site which is spreading information and evidence which contradicts the Kremlin narrative. And since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Roskomnadzor has blocked and restricted access to many famous Western social media where people could spread information about what's really happening in Ukraine. And that includes Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. With such strong grip on information and media in Russia, it's no surprise that Putin could keep his narrative and propaganda untouched. But that's not everything that Putin has done to prevent the information spreading to Russians. He also banned anti-war protests and signed harsh new laws which forbid spreading false information about his special military operation. I use this term special military operation on purpose because it was forbidden to call it Russian military action in Ukraine in terms of invasion or war, by these new laws. Also, by fake news it is meant everything that is not aligned with or approved by Kremlin, or in other words, any information or evidence that could present different perspective on this war, or even possibly question the Russian propaganda. The punishment for citizens who violate these new laws are sentenced up to 15 years in prison. 15 years in prison, can you imagine that? Now that's really crazy and serious attack on freedom of speech in Russia. But Putin probably finds this North Korean style of law as necessary to keep this propaganda in touch. With that being said, we can conclude that since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Russians have been told only one particular story, and that is that Ukrainian government is made of Nazis who commit genocide and oppress Russians in Ukraine. Now let's go back to those claims to see if there are any real weight in them. Russian President Vladimir Putin has on many occasions repeated that regime in Kiev has committed genocide against ethnic Russians in Ukraine. But in reality, he didn't present any real evidence to back this claim. The independent sources have pointed various violations of human rights from both sides, but no signs of genocide, and the numbers are indicating the same. According to the UN Commission of Human Rights, the number of civilian casualties in eastern Ukraine has fallen drastically since the beginning of the war in 2014. In 2014, the total number of civilian casualties caused by this war was 2,084, while in 2021, the number of civilian casualties was only 18. These results we wouldn't expect if there was an ongoing genocide happening. Actually, we would expect just the opposite trend, or at least much higher number of civilian casualties. But you may ask, how do we know that Ukrainian government is not hiding the genocide and so these numbers are inaccurate? Well, the reason why it would be hard to hide genocide is that there are too many independent observers on the ground. That includes organizations for cooperation and security in Europe, which represents 57 different nations whose job is to monitor situation in regarding to security of the civilians and possible violations of human rights in Ukraine. They collect data of civilian casualties and send reports of daily security situation. Also, there are many journalists and civilians who have access to platforms where they could share information about possible repression and violation of human rights, so they would provide some evidence if that was happening. And some violations were reported this way, but the actual genocide by Ukrainian government was not recognized. Also, Ukraine has submitted a court case against the Russian allegations of genocide to the UN's International Court of Justice. And this was the perfect opportunity for the both sides to present their arguments and evidence to the world. But when the hearing was held, Russian Federation refused to participate. Imagine that. You build the whole justification of invasion on the basis of the alleged genocide of your people, but when it's time to present the evidence to convince everyone, you refuse to do so. Think about it. Even if you don't give any legitimacy to the ICOG, you would still use them to present your truth to the world. Of course, if you believe that it bared any objectivity in itself. But anyway, Ukraine presented its arguments to the court and the judge concluded that there was no evidence of alleged genocide to support Kremlin's justification of war. From all of that, we cannot surely conclude that genocide didn't happen, but there is simply no evidence presented for such. Let's now discuss the Nazi claim. First, are there actual Nazis in Ukraine? The answer is definitely yes, especially in paramilitary units like Azov battalion and other anti-separatist groups. Also, does the Ukraine have a problem with far-right and neo-Nazism? Well, probably yes, but not at the magnitude as presented, and definitely not at the magnitude as presented by Vladimir Putin and Russian propaganda. In 2015, the former first commander of Azov battalion and ultranationalist Andriy Biletsky left the battalion with his former fighters and tried to get the political power by creating the far-right political party called the National Corps. And ahead of the 2019 parliamentary election, they created a coalition with other far-right parties in Ukraine, including Svoboda, the Right Sector, and so on. But when the election ended, they had very little electoral success, winning only around 2% of the nationwide electoral votes, and ultimately failed to win any seat at the Ukrainian parliament. But would we expect this result if there were a huge number of neo-Nazis and far-right Ukrainians as Putin wants us to believe? Wouldn't we expect this huge victory for Biletsky and other ultranationalists? I think that would be a logical sequence if that was the case. Anyway, let's go back to the Azov battalion for a second. Many people consider that Ukrainian government is supporting Nazism by incorporating Azov battalion into the Ukrainian National Guard. But let's take some things into consideration. First, Azov battalion have proven to be one of the best fighting units in Russia-occupied parts of Ukraine. They have temporarily retaken the important city of Mariupol from Russian forces and helped fighting pro-Russian separatists. So, Ukrainian government saw a useful ally in Azov and they decided to incorporate them into the National Guard, but also with a strict demand to strip themselves of any ideological symbols, including the fascist and the Nazi symbols. They also demanded the removal of the neo-Nazi leaders. And with all things considered, that seemed like a reasonable move. Fighting a war against Russians and home extremists at the same time would be impossible. Also, having little control over them is better than having no control at all, especially preventing the big gap which could happen between National Guard and paramilitary units after the war. Still, that doesn't mean that there are no neo-Nazis today in such units. It is true that they committed various war crimes and violated human rights, and there is absolutely no justification for that. But speaking of morality of fighting units in Ukraine, let's take a look at the Russian side. They have Russian National Unit, or RNU, which is a neo-Nazi ultra-nationalist Russian paramilitary unit. Wagner Group, which is basically Putin's private army, who as well have some neo-Nazi members. The Russian Orthodox Army, which is a Russian separatist paramilitary group which was founded by neo-Nazi members of RNU. Serbian Chetniks, which is a Serbian far-right unit famous for various war crimes across many timelines in history, which also collaborated with the Nazis in World War II. Chechens led by Kadyrov, a unit led by a leader who is known for kidnapping, torturing people, purging gay population in Chechnya, and a great ally of Vladimir Putin. So the question is, why is no one mentioning the Nazis in Russian units? And shouldn't Vladimir Putin himself be seen as a Nazi supporter since he didn't purge his units from Nazism? Obviously that logic is flawed, but the same reasoning is used by Putin to label Ukrainian government as Nazis. So, we can see that even the liberation argument presented by Putin fails to justify the invasion of Ukraine. Now, we can go to the final argument, which is undoubtedly most sincere, and that is the necessity argument. The idea behind the necessity argument is truly sovereign Ukraine is a huge threat to Russia, and by truly sovereign Ukraine, it's meant Ukraine that can make decisions without any directives from Moscow. From Russian perspective, the great danger would be if Ukraine joins the NATO, and US decides to place military units and missiles on the important strategic positions. That would surely bring harm to the Russian domination of that region. Also, the constant NATO expansion is seen as some kind of aggression, and NATO's arrival to the Russian border is simply unacceptable to Russia. On the other side, problem with this is that NATO is not forcing or pressuring nations to join them, but rather nations are willingly joining NATO in order to gain protection and security. And from Ukrainian point of view, NATO is definitely only guarantee for preventing events like these. Also, the crucial question is how can a nation be truly sovereign if they can always get blackmailed by bigger and stronger nation? And this is probably the main reason why Finland and Sweden have sent application for NATO membership as well. All in all, it's a complex issue, and just as United States wouldn't allow Russian missiles on the Mexican side of the border, it is reasonable that Russians wouldn't allow US missiles on the Ukrainian side of the border. However, that doesn't mean that they couldn't find diplomatic solution from this issue, and thinking clearly, all of this still doesn't give any legitimacy for the invasion. And that's it. Those are all the arguments used by Putin to justify and gain support for his actions in Ukraine. And as we have seen, none of the presented arguments can be seen as a sound justification for such. However, that doesn't mean that Ukraine is a saint in the whole story and that they have always acted in the most reasonable way. Reported violation of human rights by Ukrainian armed forces, controversial language laws, and general anti-Russian narrative are serious blunders, unless you want to further divide an already divided country.